Good day. This is the lecture for Chapter 7, which looks at human populations. This chapter is assigned for week 4 of the course. So let's look at human population growth. Humans are a unique case in terms of our discussion of population dynamics. In addition to the population models that do apply with humans, we have other factors that we have to look at in terms of demographics, economics, countries of origin, culture, and so on. About 4 to 5 children are born every second. About 2 people die every second. So you can look at that and see that there is a net gain of about 2.3 people every second in the world. At current rates, our population will double in 61 years. That's at current rates today. Some people warn that if we don't get some kind of control over our worldwide population, we have the ability to grow to 30 or 40 billion people. Different groups perceive population growth differently. Ecologists worry about resource depletion and society problems with constrained resources that we may already be experiencing. Economists, some, promote the benefits of more people as a source of better technology and ideas. Social views support more equitable distribution of resources rather than controlling reproduction in some cases. So you can see there's a lot of variation on how people feel about this issue. Let's begin by looking at the timeline of human population growth. At 10,000 years ago, we were about 2 to 3 million. Around 2,000 years ago, we were at 300 million worldwide. And then you can see we sort of march rapidly up to 2011, where the 7 billionth baby was born, estimated on October 31st, 2011. So you can see from the previous slide, and you can see from this table, that our growth rate is accelerating. We're experiencing an increase in our population from this growth rate. This table shows the world population progression and with doubling times. So you can see as you go back in time and you look forward, the doubling time is fewer and fewer years until we get up to 2050, and this is an estimate. So this slowing of the doubling time may become apparent as we get through the chapter. The question I would ask is, do you think we can sustain 9 billion people at 2050 on this planet? Obviously, if we're looking at our current growth rate, we cannot sustain 40 million, at least with current technology. Based on our study of growth curves that we looked at in the last chapter, what does this growth curve remind you of? This is a graph showing human population levels throughout history. What shape is this curve? Since about AD 1000, our population curve has assumed a J shape. Are we on the upward slope of a population overshoot? Will we be able to adjust our population growth to an S curve? Or can we just continue the present trend indefinitely? This is a question that this chapter asks and that we will ask as we look at other issues in future chapters. I thought it would be interesting to add another graph here, and that is the graph in the upper right. You can see our population growth curve, and we'll look at greenhouse gases in future chapters. But look at the rate of increase of our greenhouse gases shown in this curve. So I think this question is important, so I'm going to read it. Whether we will reach equilibrium soon enough at a size that can be sustained over the long term remains a difficult but important question. Using a view of some economists, is the world overcrowded, or are people themselves a resource? Some people have a different view of people. Our carrying capacity would be much less than it currently is, if not for technology. So humans are a unique species in this respect. If our agricultural productivity has increased, our ability to increase life expectancies through medicines, our sanitation efforts, our information technology, and our engineering do give us the capacity to increase our carrying capacity. So technology can increase carrying capacity. Technology can boost carrying capacity as we make progress in these areas: agriculture, engineering, commerce, and medicine. These achievements make it possible to support many more people per unit area. So part of the question is not just population growth, but how we can sustain in a sustainable way using a combination of technology and respect for resources, a population. Much of our growth, though, has been based on cheap, abundant fossil fuels. So will rising fuel prices and other constraints in terms of our ability of our planet to produce resources constrain our food production and distribution systems, and therefore our populations. We live in two demographic worlds. One is old, rich, and relatively stable. The other is young, poor, and growing rapidly. Using Google Earth, I chose two areas, one representing the rich and relatively stable, the other young, poor, and growing rapidly. You might recognize Dubai on the right, and this other picture, satellite picture, is a dense, relatively poor neighborhood in Bangkok, Thailand. The estimate of more than 7 billion people in the world in 2011, quoted earlier, is only actually a really uneducated guess. Even in the age of information technology and communication, counting the number of people in the world is like shooting at a moving target. People continue to be born and die. Furthermore, some countries never even take a census, unlike our country, and those that have been done may not be as accurate. Even the census in our own country is debated in terms of its accuracy. Governments may overstate or understate their populations to make their countries appear larger and more important, or smaller and more stable than they really are. Individuals, especially if they're homeless, refugees, illegal aliens, may not want to be counted or identified. Most people in Asia, Africa, and Latin America inhabit sort of the latter demographic world, which is young, poor, and growing rapidly. These countries represent 80% of the world population, but more than 90% of all the projected growth. This is estimated human population growth between 1750 and 2100 in less developed and more developed regions. Almost all the growth projected for the 21st century is in these less developed countries. So these less developed countries, that is our poorer, younger world, is making a larger contribution to the population growth problem, if you see it that way. Some countries in the developing world have experienced amazing growth rates and are expected to reach extraordinary population sizes by the middle of the 21st century. This table, which is on page 137 of your book, shows the 10 largest countries in the world arranged by their estimated size in 2009 and projected in 2050. Note that some countries switch positions between the two time periods. China was the most populous country throughout the 20th century, but India is expected to pass China in the 21st century. Note that they switch positions in the first two rows of the table. Nigeria, which had only 33 million residents in 1950, is forecast to have nearly 300 million in 2050. Ethiopia, with about 18 million people 50 years ago, is likely to grow nearly eightfold over the century. In many of these countries, rapid population growth is a serious problem. Bangladesh, for example, appears on the chart and is about the size of Iowa. It is already overcrowded at 150 million people. It's one of the areas most vulnerable to rising sea levels from climate change. Those rising sea levels could flood 1/3 of the country by 2050. Adding another 80 million people will be disastrous. Russia, Japan are examples of wealthier countries that have had declining populations. If you're interested in world affairs, read more in this section about how population changes are occurring and the challenges of the countries discussed. In many African countries, AIDS and other communicable diseases are killing people at a terrible rate. From this chart, you can see that the impact that AIDS is having on some countries. This is the projected population of South Africa with and without AIDS. This is a map of human population distribution around the world. Notice the high densities supported by fertile river valleys of the Nile, the Ganges, the Yellow, the Yangtze, and the Rhine rivers, and the well-watered coastal plains of India, China, and Europe. Historical factors such as technology, diffusion, and geopolitical power also play a role in geographic distribution. Zero population growth occurs when births plus immigration in a population equal deaths and immigration. So that's the DIDE equation that we talked about in Chapter 6. It takes several generations of replacement level fertility, where people just replace themselves, to reach zero population growth. Where infant mortality rates are high, the replacement level may be 5 or more children per couple. In more highly developed countries, however, this rate is usually about 2.1 children per couple, because some people are infertile, have no children who do not survive, or choose not to have children. You might have heard about China's one-child policy. When Deng Xiaoping became chairman in 1978, he introduced a highly successful but controversial one-child-per-family policy. Rural families and ethnic minorities were supposedly exempt from this rule, but local authorities often were capricious and tyrannical in applying sanctions. Ordinary families were punished harshly for having unauthorized children, while government officials and other powerful individuals could have as many as they wanted. There were many reports of bribery, forced abortions, coerced sterilization, and even infanticide as a result of this policy. Critics claim that other approaches to family planning could have reduced population growth while preserving human rights. China is currently evaluating the policy, but it has not abolished it just yet. But there's a speculation that this policy might end in 2013. You may want to read the panel discussion on page 140 of your book for more about this issue. One of the debates about what kind of level of population we can support and how we're going to get there is shown in this graph. Average total fertility rates for less developed countries fell by more than half over the past 50 years. So much of this dramatic change was due to China's one-child policy. The progress has been slower in the least developed countries, but by 2050, most projections show that they should be approaching the replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman of reproductive age. So it looks like worldwide our population may stable out. How we get there, whether we get there, if there's some other factor that changes this, is an important consideration as we try to work towards a more sustainable world. It's nice to know what population we actually have to deal with, and also then how we try to work on equitable distribution of resources and quality of life in these other countries around the world. Many people feel that we should aim for zero population growth. The Chinese experiment in population control has been very effective. China's population in 2010 was about 1.35 billion, or several hundred million less than it might have been given its trajectory in 1978. Its annual growth rate is now 0.65%, or about one-third less than the 0.98% annual growth in the United States. China is already the largest contributor to global warming and is driving up world prices for many commodities with its rapidly growing middle class. Think what the effects would be if there had been another 500 million Chinese today. China has also been far more successful in controlling population growth than India, and as you recall, India is going to exceed the population growth of China in the 21st century. At about the same time that Deng introduced his one-child plan, India, under Indira Gandhi, started a program of compulsory sterilization in an effort to reduce population growth. This draconian policy caused so much public outrage and opposition that the federal government decided to delegate family planning to individual states. Some states have been highly successful in their family planning efforts, while others have not been. The net effect, however, is that India is expected to grow to about 1.65 billion by 2050, while China is expected to reach zero population growth by 2030. India's birth rate, because of increasing wealth among their middle class, is starting to slow slightly, but not significantly enough to reach ZPG, or zero population growth, anytime soon. So you may have gathered this by now a little bit, but as incomes rise, so does life expectancy. And fertility rates tend to drop. In other words, as income levels rise, people tend to sort of naturally migrate towards less children. Some countries, such as South Africa and Russia, have far lower life expectancies than their gross domestic product, or GDP, would suggest. Jordan, on the other hand, which has only 1/10 the per capita GDP of the United States, actually has a higher life expectancy. So this chart kind of relates life expectancy with economic factors. We talked about constructing age structure tables in the previous chapter. Age structure graphs for rapidly growing, stable, and declining populations are shown in this slide. You can contrast Niger, Sweden, and Singapore. A population that is growing rapidly by natural increase has more young people than does a stationary population. So you can show these phenomena in these types of graphs. These are found on page 141 of your book. For more information, I added these similar graphs from some of the countries we're talking about. So compare the histograms in your text figure to these, showing the same graphs for the United States, China, and India. These graphs show the U.S. age structure in 2000 and also in 2100. So you can see how these change as the age structures of the population shift. As you can see, the U.S. growth will be stabilizing. So now let's look at some aspects of U.S. human population growth. It is probably no accident that the U.S. is having a heated debate about entitlement programs right now. Both rapidly growing countries and slowly growing countries can have problems with their dependency ratio, or the number of non-working compared to working individuals in a population. In Mexico, for example, each working person supports a high number of children. In the United States, by contrast, a declining working population is now supporting an ever larger number of retired persons, and there are dire predictions that the Social Security system will soon be bankrupt. The graph shows U.S. birth rates going back to 1909. You can see the hike in birth rates during our post-war baby boom. You can also see the smaller peak starting in the late 70s, was sometimes referred to as the baby boomlet in other terms, because of all the boomers were starting to have families. Sort of hidden in all this debate is what to do about the boomers. By the mid-21st century, children under age 15 will make up a smaller percentage of the world population, while people over 65 will contribute a larger share of the population. This graph shows the problem. This is a review of the different factors that affect human populations. Immigration is a controversial issue in many countries. Guest workers often perform heavy, dangerous, or disagreeable work that citizens are unwilling to do. Many migrants and alien workers are of a different racial or ethnic background than the majority in their new home. They generally are paid low wages and given substandard housing, poor work conditions, and fewer rights. Local residents often complain, however, that immigrants take away jobs, overload social services, and ignore established rules of behavior and social values. I'm not sure all this is really true. But anti-immigrant groups are springing up in many rich countries, including our own. We are currently debating immigration policy in this country because of new immigration reform laws that are in committees in Congress right now. There's an interesting discussion taking place in the news. Pay attention to some of this and form your own opinion. This graph shows birth rates in the United States from 1910 to 2000. The falling birth rate from 1910 to 1929 represents a demographic transition from an agricultural to an industrial society. The baby boom following World War II lasted from 1945 to 1965. A much smaller and the term echo boom occurred around 1980 when the baby boomers started to reproduce. So economic and social development influence birth and death rates. The average replacement rate is 2.1 to obtain zero population growth. 100 out of 220 countries, so you see about half, are now at or below zero population growth. So the question becomes is, what can we do in these 100 countries, and without changes in technology, how do we encourage zero population growth? If fertility declines were to occur everywhere, the global population would begin to decline about 2050, and the world population might be below about 6 billion by 2150. Now when I was in school, kind of where all you are, the world population was about 2 billion. And when I took sort of environmental courses back then, the carrying capacity of the world was estimated at about 6 billion. So there's a little hope here in terms of our population growth and where it might be. That doesn't mean that we're sustainable. But as we go into these other issues, we'll come back to looking at the world population and how that might affect some of our resource issues, and then maybe how we achieve sustainability. Theoretical birth, death, and population growth rates in a demographic transition accompanying economic and social development is shown in this graph. In a pre-development society, birth and death rates are both high, and a total population remains relatively stable. During development, death rates tend to fall first, followed in a generation or two by falling birth rates. Total population grows rapidly until both birth and death rates stabilize in a fully developed society. So this is a graph showing population projections for different growth scenarios. So recent progress in family planning and economic development have led to significantly reduced estimates compared to some years ago. The median projection is about 8.9 billion in 2050, compared to previous estimates over 10 billion for that date. So I put an arrow here at between 6 and medium, because the question is, can we attain sustainability if we manage to achieve a moderate level of population that's stable in the world? So which of these scenarios will we follow? As you have seen in this chapter, population growth is a complex subject, and I kind of went rapidly through some of the material here. To accomplish a stabilization or reduction of human populations will require substantial changes from business as usual. An encouraging sign is that worldwide contraceptive use has increased sharply in recent years. About half of the world's married couples use some family planning techniques in 2000, compared to only 10% 30 years earlier. But another 100 million couples say that they want but do not have access to family planning. Contraceptive use varies widely by region. More than 70% of women in Latin America use some form of birth control, compared to 51% in Asia, excluding China, and only 21% in Africa. So keep these questions and projections in mind as we explore environmental issues facing this population of humans in our world. This is our last slide, ending the presentation.